Not again.
How? Again? Again? What's again?
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. These sessions are recorded live in person and you can join them in the meetup or online. Today we'll be talking to Victoria Margree about the radical feminism of Shulamith Firestone.
Thank you so much for Vicky for coming today to talk about Firestone. There's a load of books that I'm using for the next few sessions. One of them is Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, which is the main book we'll be talking about today. And the other one is Vicky's own book, which is on the radical feminism of Shulamith Firestone. And it's with Zero Books. And it's a really fantastic book. Sometimes Firestone is like, there's so many great ideas, but it's kind of buried beneath lots of other stuff. And it's kind of sometimes like you're reading through it and you end up spending a lot of time thinking, I don't know how I feel about this. And then sometimes you can miss some of the really exciting bits of her work. And what I thought was really good about Vicky's book is that it took all those really great bits and brought them right to the front and actually did spend time on some of the more difficult or the not so exciting bits, but changed the emphasis. And I really recommend it. I just want to sort of open really just asking how the project came about.
So Toby and I teach on a humanities programme at the University of Brighton, and I kind of inherited a year 3 module on feminisms. And when you're a junior lecturer in your first year, you kind of get told, like, teach this. So I inherited a reading list which had Firestone on it, and I hadn't read Firestone before. So I had the usual kind of, lecturer, in the first year of work thing of, oh my God, how am I going to read enough of this to be able to produce a lecture on it? And from there, I started teaching Firestone, and I taught Firestone for about 10 years. Really enjoyed teaching the Dialectic of Sex, found that the students were engaging in a very open-minded way, but also a critical way. So had lots of thoughts about it. But I never had any kind of intention of writing a book on Firestone. But then one of my current students on that module sent me an email that was titled, "Have you seen this?" And this was a kind of call for proposals by Zero Books. So, Zero are this, you probably know them, but Zero are this publisher who are into the idea, I suppose, of the kind of public intellectuals. So taking intellectual or academic debates, but rendering them accessible both in the way that they're written about, but in the form of books which don't cost 80 quid, so no one but a university library is going to buy them. And they were introducing a new series called Neglected or Misunderstood, where the idea was precisely to look for those thinkers that had unjustly been neglected, or indeed had actually received quite a kind of distorting response. And I think both is true of Firestone. And they were looking for someone to write an introduction to Firestone. And I thought, wow, that could be interesting and that could be fun. So I sent off a proposal and it was kind of well received and it went from there. But it meant that I had to think about Firestone in a different way, because in the course of teaching it, I suppose I was thinking, how does this connect up with things that the students have already read and thought about? How can I provoke them to kind of question things that are going on here? How can I ask the students to think about what might be valuable about this? But I hadn't really thought, what exactly do I think about this? And I was aware that I was generally pretty positively inclined to this Firestone, despite all the problems, which I'm sure we're going to come on to. But writing the book really kind of forced me to crystallise my thinking around, okay, am I saying that we should just be reading Firestone as a kind of interesting cultural text that reveals something about second-wave feminism and reveals something about that moment at the end of the 1960s, start of the 70s, where second-wave feminism, particularly radical feminism, was really emerging? Because it's certainly an incredibly valuable, illuminating text from that point of view. Or am I also saying there's actually something worthwhile in this for us today as feminists? And I came to think that yes, I did think something along the latter lines. But that was what the process was really, and that's how the book came about.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. So could you tell us a little bit about who Firestone was?
Yeah, so she was born in 1945. She was born in Canada. She grew up, I think, in the Midwest of the United States, and she went to the Chicago Institute of Art. So she was actually all the time a kind of practicing artist, developing as an artist. So in Chicago, she was involved in, I think she might have founded a group within the women's liberation movement. She then relocated to New York, where she became incredibly active in the women's liberation movement scene. So she founded a number of radical feminist groups that became increasingly radical. I think, like many radical feminists of that period, she started off as being part of a kind of progressive leftist circles, which wasn't necessarily specifically feminist, but was more women involved in leftist politics. Increasingly became frustrated by the kind of sexism within counterculture and ended up branching off into a kind of female roots only. So she ended up co-founding New York Radical Feminists after having co-founded the Red Stockings. So she was a really important figure within the kind of the feminist activist circles in New York in that period. She's known as having been, she's known for her kind of fierce intellect, also for her confrontational style of politics. So someone called Alice Eccles has written a kind of book about the feminism of that period, and Eccles recounts this story that she was told of a women's group involving Firestone went to the editor of something called Ladies' Home Journal, and they had a number of things that they wanted the editor to do, and he was refusing. So Firestone jumped up on his desk and ripped up copies of his magazine. Her own book, The Dialectic of Sex, which is very much a manifesto, came out in a particular context. So it came out in a context where, many people will know the politics of the women's liberation movement was no leaders, anti-hierarchy. And that produced, I think, a bit of a dilemma, because on the one hand, there was the desire to produce writing that would be read as well more widely, read potentially by so-called mainstream society. But then that also compelled the authors to a kind of situation of fame or renown that ran contrary to the no leaders, anti-hierarchy politics of the movement. And I think Firestone experienced quite a lot of difficulties around that. There was quite a lot of resentment, difficult kind of personal relationships. And she retreated from the scene of feminist politics really very shortly after the Dialectic came out. And then she really kind of disappeared from view. She didn't publish any feminist writings again. She focused on her career as an artist. So she wasn't really kind of well known again after that kind of brief moment of fame. She produced a book called Airless Spaces, which we might come on to in 1998, which was about 10 years, I think, before her death. So that's a brief sketch of her life, I guess. It's actually maybe worthwhile me saying that Firestone was the subject of a film. I think this was a film. This was a documentary film that was made by students at, I think, the Chicago Institute, but I might be wrong. It might be New York. But basically, it was about the kind of, the upcoming generation. And so they interviewed Firestone, and there are scenes of Firestone being really given a kind of dressing down by one of her art instructors, and Firestone's kind of pushing back against that. And that film was then sort of remade by Elizabeth Suber in the 1990s, I think. And that film is now available. It's called Shulamith. So if people would like to know more about Firestone as the young art student, that film is really worthwhile.
So in your chapter entitled Women's Oppression is Natural, you write, nothing, it seems, is less human than to let nature take its course. So drawing on de Beauvoir and Marx, John Stuart Mill, you draw out a sort of Firestonian philosophy of nature. So what is this philosophy of nature? And in what ways should it challenge the way we think about activism around feminism or environmentalism today?
So basically, along with most other radical feminists of the period, she thinks that patriarchy is transcultural and transhistorical, so it's always existed. There are no cultures, either at the time that she's writing or ever in human history, that haven't been characterised by some form of male domination and the oppression of women. And Firestone says, how can we make sense of that? Why could that be the case? And she says, well, it can't be, therefore, that women's oppression is a phenomenon of legal arrangements, because, of course, those will always vary. It can't be that it's a phenomenon of cultural arrangements, because those will vary. It can't be that it's a phenomenon of economic structures, because those are always going to vary. If it really does have this universal status, then it must be because it's natural in some sense. So she argues that the etiology of women's oppression actually lies in biological differences between men and women. Now, she's not interested in, differences in muscular strength, for example. What she's interested in is the reproductive functions. So she says the natural inequality or the natural division of labour is this, that women are the ones who become pregnant, gestate, give birth to a child, and nurse that child. And she postulates that in early human societies, before there would have been kind of sufficient knowledge about human fertility or sufficiently developed technologies to intervene into human technology, then it would have been the case that the majority of women of childbearing age would have been caught up in a kind of constant cycle of pregnancy, difficult labour, nursing children, repeat. And that constant cycle would effectively have taken those people out of other forms of social activity, particularly those forms of social activity which were based around production. So this is a natural division of labour, she says, which sort of immediately yields a natural inequality, because it takes women outside of production, it puts them into the sphere of reproduction, and it renders them dependent upon men to provide things like food and shelter. And it also takes women out of other forms of prestigious social and cultural activity. So this sets up, she says, a kind of inequality, a relationship of dependency. Women are made dependent upon men. She then suggests, and I don't think that she gives a kind of adequate account of why this should always be the case, but she then suggests that men kind of enjoy that situation of women being dependent upon them and seek to reinforce women's dependency by producing cultural arrangements, economic arrangements, laws, which augment their power over women. And she further suggests that being always kind of in love with domination, men then start to generate bases upon which to create further classes, because Firestone suggests that basically sex is class. Women's reproductive function renders them an exploited class. She says men then generate further classes, castes based on economic status, etc., etc. So the origins of all of this are in some sense natural. Now that's quite a kind of striking claim, because most feminists of the time, and probably today, would want to deny that patriarchy has its origins in nature, because the fear would be that if you say that something is natural, you are therefore saying that it's inevitable and that it can't be changed. So it could look like a kind of counsel of despair. Well, if it's natural, what more is there to be said? What could be done about it? But Firestone is specifically not saying that, and 5 minutes later I'm starting now to answer your questions. So Firestone goes to Beauvoir and to Marx and says both of these thinkers recognise something really important, which is that the natural is not a human value. I think that's from Marx. Or from Beauvoir, that human nature is a kind of antithesis. In other words, what's distinctively human is in some sense to be against nature. So what Firestone takes that to mean is that unlike any other animal species, I suppose, humans learn about the laws of nature in order to be able to intervene into nature, to change natural environments, in order to better suit our own purposes. So she says, actually, we don't, as a species, we don't tend to think that what is natural is good, and we don't tend to think that what is natural is therefore justified, and we don't tend to think that what is natural is inevitable. Where there are natural states of affairs which don't suit our goals or our values, we use technology to intervene into them. So on the basis of that, she says, okay, well, even if the origins of the problem are natural, that doesn't mean it can't be changed. We need, therefore, to change nature. So in Firestone's work, there's this affirmation of technology. Technology understood very broadly as just a way of intervening into nature in order to better realise human beings' goals. And she says we can use nature, therefore, to interrupt this kind of tyranny of reproduction that women in the past would have been subject to. So she's really, really excited about the kind of reproductive technologies which are in existence in 1969 when she's writing. So that's obviously the contraceptive pill, it's technologies for abortion. But she's also looking forward to the development of IVF. She also famously looks forward to the possible development of artificial wombs, a suggestion that she got massively kind of ridiculed for, because she sees these technologies as, at least in principle, entailing the possibility of liberating women from their reproductive roles and therefore removing the original basis of women's oppression. So it's this kind of anti-naturalism that says, and here I'm channeling the xenofeminists who are kind of like contemporary feminists who have gone back to Firestone. There's this kind of anti-naturalism that says that, first of all, claims about something's being natural are generally ideological. Secondly, the natural, probably now in scare quotes, should never be a kind of a limiting factor in our imaginations of what's possible. It should never be something that limits the way we conceive of a progressive society, because it's distinctively human to intervene.
So, yeah, in the chapter Sex Class is the First Class, you write, what is quite distinctive about Firestone is that she supplies a materialist explanation for the apparent ubiquity of male domination. So what is Firestone's materialism? How does that differ, say, from Marx and Engels?
Yeah. So Firestone's quite interesting because although she's typically identified as a radical feminist, she's also, in a certain sense, a kind of socialist feminist or a Marxist feminist. Whereas a kind of dominant leftist idea at the time was that Marxism or socialism could already address women's issues, and feminism, therefore, in a sense, could be incorporated or was already incorporated within Marxism. Firestone is saying, no, it's got to be the other way around. Marxism should be incorporated within radical feminism. And Firestone understands herself as being materialist in the sense, I think, that for Marx and Engels, it's that ideas, culture come out of material questions. So for them, the fundamental driver of history is how is it that human beings at any moment in time are producing things that they need in order to live? And as those relations of production, forces of production change, that is the motor of all other kinds of changes in history, changes in society, politics, etc., etc. So Firestone is broadly saying, yes, I agree with that. We need to start with the level of the material in that sense. But for Firestone, she says this explicitly, Marx and Engels weren't materialist enough because they think that the materialist bedrock is production. Firestone, of course, says, no, it's reproduction. Before we're interested in how it is humans produce food, clothing, shelter, etc., we should be interested in how it is that human beings reproduce themselves. How is it that the species replenishes itself? How is it that human beings are even made, brought into existence? So she turns explicitly to Engels. So Engels had written The Origins of the Family, and Engels' texts have been taken up with considerable excitement by many socialist feminists of the period, because Engels was arguing that the oppression of women had an historical origin. So basically, and this is a really kind of crude version of it, but basically he kind of says, he draws upon an anthropologist at the time, and he says the earliest human societies were kind of nomadic tribes who were basically sexually egalitarian. So there might have been some division of labour precisely because of women's reproductive labour, but that didn't produce a class system and it didn't produce sexual inequality. But he suggests as then human societies become more advanced and become agricultural, they eventually reach a point where they're able to produce surplus rather than just immediately consuming the things that they produce. Surplus means that you get property, and once you've got property, questions arise about how property is going to be transferred, in particular how it's going to be passed down through generations. At that point, Engels suggests a kind of happy polygamy, promiscuity that has characterized human societies up to that point gets replaced by a patriarchal system. So men continue to have multiple sexual partners, but they start to limit the sexual freedom of the women in their lives, because basically they want to be sure that they are passing on their property to their biological offspring. So Engels says property represents the world historical defeat of the female. Property lies at the origins of women's oppression. And that argument was, as I said, taken up quite excitedly by socialist feminists because it posits, there was an origin to this. And because there was an origin to this, we can therefore also see a point where it would be transcended. The socialist revolution, basically, the movement to a communist society will get rid of property relations as we know it and will create the space for a restitution of sexual egalitarianism. Firestone says, yes, that communist revolution is needed, but it needs to be just as much a feminist revolution. So she draws this analogy, just as Marx and Engels call for a proletariat to seize the means of production from the ruling classes. Women need to recognise that they are an oppressed class and they need to seize the means of reproduction from the ruling classes, by which she means these reproductive technologies which currently are in the hands of a kind of male-dominated political elites and medical establishments. So she posits this kind of, revolution which will be a communist revolution and a feminist revolution and will yield some kind of utopian post-revolutionary society which will be characterised both by communism and by feminism. Don't know if that.
Yeah, that really, really
yeah.
good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know Marx and Engels' work as well as I should do. So I'm very, very aware that there are lots of debates about whether Firestone is really materialist and whether Marx and Engels understand it. There's also debates about whether her idea that women constitute a class really works in the ways that Marx and Engels understand class. I feel like I don't really have the kind of expertise to be able to get deeply into that. But just to flag up, I think, those are questions. And I think potentially that others who want to respond to, you might want to respond to.
I was just dreaming about the utopian vision of a practice of social reproduction that's claimed by those who are typically oppressed by it, and that is kind of put in service of a feminist, communist, hopefully anti-racist revolution. But yeah, I'm sure we'll come to the anti-racist bit, but not to get ahead to that. I wondered whether she sets out in that kind of utopian vision a communal or communitarian practice of social reproduction, like getting rid of parents or mothers especially is this individual thing in a nuclear family, and there's like child caring that is communal. Like, is that part of her vision?
Yes, 100%. So for her, I mean, I haven't really said this yet, but she's massively against the nuclear family. She sees the nuclear family as this kind of entirely toxic arrangement. It's an arrangement that is deforming women for children, and actually a kind of a politics of children's liberation is a really important aspect of Firestone's work. But she also sees the nuclear family as being deforming of men and male psychology. So absolutely, in this kind of post-revolutionary society, there will be a different form of care for the young.
Yeah.
And it will take the form of what she calls households. So she wants to even get rid of the very language of family.
Yeah.
So the household would be effectively a group of adults, 7 to 10 adults, I think she says, who would contract to live together for a period of time in order to bring up children.
Mm.
And those children may or may not be genetically related to any of the adults in the household. If they were genetically related, that would be insignificant. That's not something that there would be any kind of emotional investment in. Firestone thinks that the household would need to stay together probably for something like 13, 15 years. And the reason she thinks that's the case is because she thinks that the period of childhood dependency is actually artificially extended by patriarchal relations. And that in a different form of community, children would be able to become independent much sooner than is presently the case. And this is a space in which children would be so there would be multiple adults involved. Those would be adults who would be of different ages. I mean, so I was earwigging Caroline. So you've said a couple of things at the start about how Brighton is kind of non-ageist. For Firestone, that's one of the problems with society, that there is this kind of stratification in terms of age. So, if you are an older person, you probably don't mix much with younger people unless you have children or grandchildren. And she sees that as being very, very artificial, very damaging, actually, as well. So one of the things about a household for her is that it would involve people who, it could involve single people, infertile couples, older people, effectively anybody who wished to be involved in caring for and nurturing a young person as they grow to independence. And it would involve this kind of, intermingling of the generations in a way that isn't currently possible.
You said, one of the things that Firestone's keen on pointing out about, in response to Marx or Engels is that they weren't socialists, they weren't materialists enough.
Yeah.
And so we have at this kind of lowest level the reproduction upon which production is dependent, and that is regulated by kind of biological relationships, limitations, you say, or limitations moving on, or conditions first.
Yeah.
But something in Marx, as you were talking about that, this is Marx 21, chapter 25, I think, and it's the ultimate law or the absolute law of capitalist accumulation. I think that's what the chapter's called, chapter 25, I'm sure. And he says that the population size is regulated by essentially what we'd say the needs of the economy, you might say, which is a striking sociological thesis, right? To say that so reproduction. So the argument then is that reproduction is determined by the economic system, by the modes, relations of production. Now I don't think that undermines, if Marx is right about that, and it's a contestable sociological thesis. I think it's a grand one, it's a big story. If Marx is right about that, then it seems to raise questions about the interplay between the materialism that Firestone's interested in and how that is, if you like, articulated or plays out, or in different economic systems under different social relations. Because it would seem that if Marx is right, then in addition to this kind of material, very biological base that Firestone's interested in, there's also regulation by the social relations. So you seem to have this complex interplay where both are kind of regulating or conditioning, if you like, each other. So that was what I was thinking about. And
I don't think Firestone would deny that. I mean, one of the criticisms of Firestone is that she's ahistoricizing, that she's not sufficiently attentive to different historical formations. So she kind of just posits, she's overgeneralizing. She's just kind of positing this. She's imagining that the reproduction of children within families is the same throughout all times and places. Or at least she's not sufficiently attentive to the ways in which that changes. And I think that's a complex one. I think to some extent that criticism has purchased, to some extent it's not quite fair. I think she basically kind of distinguishes, for example, between the biological family and the nuclear family, right? Because the biological family, I think in her understanding of it, is basically man supplies sperm, woman supplies egg, biological child results. Obviously, that looks quite close to the nuclear family, as it would have been at least idealised within the 1960s. Husband, wife, genetic, children. But she's very clear, as are Marx and Engels, that the nuclear family is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. You know, it hasn't existed through all times and spaces. So she's absolutely aware that child rearing has, you know, the production of children, reproduction of child rearing has taken place in different social formations in different societies throughout time. But for her, it will always have involved some degree of exploitation of women, some degree of women's being made dependent upon men, some degree, therefore, of male power over women, precisely because the biological family itself has remained intact throughout time. And that's why for her, these reproductive technologies are required, because they represent the possibility of dismantling not just the nuclear family, but the biological family as well. So I think, you know, if the kind of point that you're taking from Marx is that the needs of the mode of production basically change the form that the family takes and therefore the form that reproduction takes, she would agree with that, but she would want to say that the nucleus of oppression is there in all instances. So she absolutely recognised that, you know, previously there have been kind of extended family arrangements for raising children. And I think she probably thinks that that's better than the nuclear family. You know, I think for her, a problem with, or a potential problem with even that kind of extended family model is if there's still a sense that the biological parents are really the parents. Because one of the things that she's really trying to undermine is the idea of the child as property.
The attachment.
The idea that there is somebody who owns the child. Yeah. And she thinks that that's so problematic because it sets up, well, I mean, she says it means that you get these kind of weird ego investments. So she says the father typically kind of invests in the child narcissistically as a continuation of his name, his ethnic identity, the promise of his immortality, and then you get loads of pressure on, you know, the child to fulfill the unfulfilled ambitions of the child, etc. For the mother,
There's a second chance type thing. It's like a child.
Exactly. Yeah. Everything that he didn't quite produce. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But she's also got this really interesting argument about for the mother. So she says, you know, the situation of women in patriarchal society is basically that they have to justify their existence. And one of the main ways they can justify their existence is by becoming a mother. But that, she says, means that women have this kind of incentive to keep children in a relationship of dependency for longer than is actually necessary. So Katia invited me to Slovenia, to Ljubljana, in 2019 for a symposium. So Katia is the translator of Firestone's Dialectic of Sex into Slovene. I think your question was, Firestone kind of suggests that all antagonisms emerge ultimately from the kind of contradictions and inequalities produced by relations of reproduction rather than production. And you were asking if that analysis is really in any way kind of sustainable still today, how it would work, for example, in relationship to racism. Firestone, she's telling this kind of story where men as a class oppress women as a class, and that induces a particular psychology into men. And it's a psychology of chauvinism, or a kind of enjoyment of power and enjoyment of being dominant over others. And that then induces men to produce further exploited classes on the basis of economic class, on the basis of so-called caste, on the basis of so-called race. So Firestone thinks that kind of ultimately all oppressions are based upon that original oppression of sex oppression. And this is deeply problematic because it leads her to think, in a sense, that everything comes down to sexist oppression, and therefore to give sex oppression a priority over other forms of oppression. And that manifests particularly in a chapter on racism in the Dialectic of Sex, which is a really, really bad chapter. I'm about to say lots of bad things about it, so I'm going to risk saying one thing in Firestone's favour, which is that she does at least try to think about racism, and she does at least try to recognise racism as an urgent political concern, which is not necessarily what all white feminists in the period were doing. But that's about as much that I can say in favour of this chapter. So basically, Firestone develops an analysis of racism, which is based around her interpretation of Freud's Oedipus complex. Oh. So Firestone's relationship to Freud is in itself quite interesting. Firestone thinks that she describes Freudianism as a kind of misguided feminism. So the idea is that Freud gets something fundamentally right, which is that he recognises the crucial importance of sex and reproduction in human lives. But at that point, he then goes desperately wrong, because he recognises the pathologies of the nuclear family, but he imagines that those pathologies must necessarily always exist. And he therefore develops a therapy that's designed to accommodate or align women and children to their oppression within the family and within patriarchal society, rather than recognising that society could be radically transformed, and then the pathologies of the family and the pathologies of gender and individual psychological development would change or disappear. So with this idea in place, Firestone then proceeds to kind of use her understanding of the Oedipus complex as a basis for understanding racism in American society. So she has this argument that says that African American men are like the Oedipal son. They envy the white father his position of power, and they desire to acquire that position for themselves. At the same time, they recognise that they have a certain affinity with white women, i.e. the white mother, in that both are, yeah, exactly. Carolyn's face is expressing it all. in that both are oppressed by the white father. And this induces a kind of dilemma in the black man, the Oedipal son, which leads him to ultimately kind of seek to dominate white women in order to achieve the position of the white father for himself. What's the position of the African-American woman in relationship to all of this? Well, Firestone says kind of very, very badly treated by black men and white men as well, either kind of pacified or treated as a kind of whore. I mean, that's the language that she actually uses. So this is intensely problematic for all sorts of reasons. As Angela Davis, as Hortense Spillers has observed, she unwittingly recycles various racist tropes. So she basically puts black women in a position beyond political agency. So at the same time that Firestone is kind of supposedly empathizing with black women and their victimization, she also sees victimization as almost the only possibility for them. She can't conceive of political agency on their part whatsoever. At the same time, she kind of recycles basically racist tropes of black men as presenting a sexual threat to white women. There is absolutely no analysis in her chapter of slavery and the legacies of slavery or post-emancipation segregation and ongoing structural racism. It's all pinned on this kind of incredibly dubious Oedipalization of American race relations. She makes this really, really weird distinction between authentic racism and inauthentic racism, in as much as she says that the racism of white women is a kind of inauthentic racism. What she means by that is that racism, in a sense, really ensues from white men as part of this desire to dominate other groups of people. And at the same time as all of that is going on, Firestone is really incredibly neglectful of the history in the United States of the use of reproductive technologies to abuse African-American women. And I'm thinking about the kind of eugenicist history of forced sterilizations, coerced or forced abortions, for example. She only very briefly and rather glibly alludes to that. So apart from that, she she fairly sort of, celebrates reproductive technologies and entirely marginalises that history. So it's very, very apparent, and coming back to Katia, so and I know that you know this, it's very, very apparent from Firestone's text itself that this privileging of a singular antagonism, men as a sex class versus women as a sex class, does not in any way, in any adequate way, enable a recognition or thinking through of the multiple antagonisms that operate within society. I think it's the major flaw in Firestone's work and the major difficulty in any kind of project of going back to Firestone's work to say, are there things here which are valuable and which could be repurposed for feminism today?
But can't we see that as a limitation rather than a flaw, and the fact that her family were interned in the camps? And also I think her sort of, her interest in Freud is very much to do with that, very much of that moment. So I think that generation in the 60s of feminists are just beginning to see Freud as a way to kind of, to take up a feminist argument.
Yeah.
It's very nascent in that decade. I think we have a very different feeling about it now.
I mean, the point about Firestone's own Jewish origins is really interesting, and I have, so in the Airless Spaces book, the book that she publishes in 1998, her second and last book, it gets revealed right at the end, Firestone talks right at the end about the really horrific anti-Semitism that she and her family suffered. And I have wondered, and this is purely conjecture, whether that experience of a form of racism meant that she was a little bit more attentive to issues of racism and the urgency of racism.
I had two questions for the first half. One was about the family, partly because I was kind of questioning how sometimes I couldn't relate always to Firestone's notion of the patriarchal families. And then the other thing that I was wanting to sort of mention was this idea around pregnancy. And so I wanted to just say a few quotes from Firestone. So one, Firestone says that pregnancy is barbaric. She also says pregnancy is the temporary deformation of the body of the individual for the sake of the species. And she also quotes a friend as saying childbirth is like shitting a pumpkin. And so in some ways I find those, on the one hand, seem quite liberating, because in some ways we have such a sentimentalized view of childbirth that actually it's really almost feels liberating to have someone say that. That also, one of the things that you're really exploring in the book is some of the problems with the ways she characterizes the pregnant body.
Yes, she does say all of those things. And I do think, as you say, that at one level it's an important corrective to kind of sentimentalization of pregnancy and childbirth. And it's really, really, really important to create a space to talk about the physical difficulties, the fears, the anxieties, the harms, the pain, the potential trauma of those processes. I think that was needed then in 1970, and it's still needed today. And I think there's inadequate attention to birth trauma, for example, trauma of labour, and inadequate resources, I'm sure, kind of directed into that. So, the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, and childbirth in human species does seem to be particularly dangerous. I think I read that in places. That's really, really important. It's really, really important to foreground that as a feminist issue. I think that's one of the things that makes Firestone so important. But against that, there's this one-sidedly negative treatment of pregnancy and childbirth and paternity, really, in Firestone's work. The quotations that you gave us. So the pregnant body is seen by Firestone as being deformed. At one level, one thing she's doing there is channeling Beauvoir, because Beauvoir makes very similar comments about how women are made the victim of the species. For Beauvoir, what that's about is that women have to give up their projects, basically, in order to reproduce the species. Men don't have that burden. But in Firestone, it really does take on this kind of physical, visceral meaning. She expresses a kind of fear of pregnancy and the processes of pregnancy, and almost a kind of disgust of it as well. So I think it's with an actual kind of abjection of the pregnant body. And she, and Beauvoir as well, accused by Elizabeth Spellman of somatophobia, so fear of the body. What Spellman says about somatophobia is very interesting. She says basically that, there's a long, in Western thought, there's a kind of long history by which male thinkers identify women with their bodies in order to inferiorize them. So, mind-body dualism runs through Western philosophy, but Western culture more broadly. That isn't simply a binary, it's also a binary in which mind is seen as a superior term. Body is everything that mind needs to transcend in order, for example, for philosophical thought to happen. Women get associated with their bodies, women are seen as being kind of locked into, imprisoned within their bodies, inferiorized by that closer connection to their bodies that they supposedly have than men. So Feldman says in relationships and all of that, it's completely understandable that many female writers have wanted to detach women from that identification with their bodies, have wanted to write and speak and think as if it would be better if we were not embodied. And that's what Firestone does. Firestone is basically caught up in a kind of desire to transcend the body, but particularly the female body. The female body is seen as a kind of an entrapment within a kind of inferiorized subjectivity. And I think that's right. I think that's at work within Firestone's text. At the same time, as there is something valuable about Firestone trying to rip away the kind of sentimentalizing veil around pregnancy and childbirth.
So I just thought we could start back by talking a little bit about, in your forthcoming essay entitled The Dangerous Utopianism of Shulamith Firestone, you write that the dialectics can be read positively as feminist science fiction and as critical utopianism. In what ways is the Dialectics of Sex a piece of feminist science fiction or critical utopianism?
In terms of how the Dialectic of Sex was received, and it was kind of a bestseller apparently, and it was on the supermarket shelves, and Firestone was interviewed on TV, so it was quite a sensation. But it was also, not surprisingly, extremely controversial, and it was very often ridiculed. And one of the things it was ridiculed for was precisely Firestone's suggestion that in the post-revolutionary society, biological reproduction would no longer be to take place. Babies could be conceived, gestated and born entirely outside of the body. So ectogenesis, basically artificial wombs. And that was really focused upon, probably disproportionately, because I'm not convinced it's that massive, that central to Firestone's argument. Although, as someone did point out, therefore possibly shouldn't have stuck an artificial womb on the cover of the book. But it led in particular the Dialectic of Sex often to be dismissed, and to be dismissed precisely as science fiction. So this is a kind of, this is not serious political theory, this is not even serious kind of feminist work. This is science fiction. We can dismiss this. We don't need to read it. But what I was wanting to do in that essay, which is coming out in the volume, by the way, that Katia is producing from the Slovenia Symposium. What I wanted to do was kind of reclaim that idea of feminist science fiction, because Firestone herself does that. So Firestone's final chapter in the Dialectic is an attempt to imagine what the post-revolutionary society might look like. And she says very explicitly, this isn't about laying down the blueprint. The actual form that a post-revolutionary society would take is something that will and should be decided organically through the process of transition and revolution itself. But she said the danger of not responding to the question, what's your alternative, is that people will say, well, there is no alternative then. The status quo is the only thing that could be. So she takes the risk of utopianism. She takes the risk of offering us a picture of what a utopian society might look like. She says, our kind of imaginations are incredibly inhibited. And she says there's not even a feminist science fiction tradition, or there's not even a feminist utopian tradition that we can draw upon. And that's quite an interesting comment, because there soon would be. The 1970s is basically the decade of feminist science fiction. Joanne Russ, Marge Piercy, who we might be talking about shortly. But when Firestone herself was writing in 1969, it's actually true, I think, that there's not yet a feminist kind of science fiction or utopian fiction tradition. So I think Firestone is offering up her image of a utopian society in a kind of fictional vein, but she's offering it up in order to inspire us, in order to get us thinking about what an alternative to the pretty horrible society that we live in might actually look like. So yeah, I wanted to kind of reclaim that idea of science fiction, which I guess is partly about imagining a future where technology could be put to progressive ends. And Firestone, as I've said already, absolutely does think that technology can be used progressively. And I think the critical utopianism part is, utopianism sometimes gets a bad rap, and Firestone is very aware of this. So the idea of utopianism is that it's potentially dangerous because it prescribes what the future society should look like, and it might be authoritarian in, trying to bring about its utopia. It's going to restrict freedom and seriously punish people that diverge from the blueprint. Utopia is about a better society, not about a perfect society. It's a kind of provocation to continually try to imagine something that is better than what we currently have.
In your discussion of Marge Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time, you write that Piercy's novel is much more than a literary illustration of Firestone's theoretical speculations, not least in the way that it adds to Firestone's analysis and perhaps even attempts to fill in the gaps. So how is Women on the Edge of Time building upon Firestone's thought?
So basically it was published in 1976, so 6 years after the Dialectic of Sex came out, and it's generally regarded as being Piercy putting into, or Piercy imagining in novel form, Firestone's post-revolutionary society, a kind of cybernetic, communist, feminist society. So it has a protagonist called Connie Ramos. Connie is a Mexican-American woman in 1970s America who is oppressed in virtue of her sex, her racialization, her economic class. Connie becomes institutionalized within the psychiatric system, wrongly so, the novel inclines us to believe, because she's not mentally ill. She's resisting. She's trying to resist aspects of her circumstances. And Connie becomes, at least apparently, visited by a figure from a future society called Metapoisis. And Connie is therefore able to time travel to the future to explore this different community, Metapoisis. And so Metapoisis is basically kind of a version of Firestone society. So children have 3 co-mothers, and their co-mothers can be male or they can be female. So parenting is dispersed, and it's dispersed for the reasons that Firestone thinks that it needs to be dispersed. It's a kind of communistic society where there's no monetary economy. Resources are distributed according to need, and many other resources are just kind of held in common. And children are thought of as being everybody's child. So children belong to the whole community. There's this moment where Connie is kind of perplexed by the fact that in the eating hall, that there's this kind of communal space where everybody eats, there are children's drawings up all over the place. And Connie says, I don't get this. I get that, you like your own kids' drawings, but no one's interested in other kids' drawings. And her kind of guides from Metapoisis say, what do you mean? They're all our children. So it's imagining kind of Firestone's society. So in my article, I'm trying to think about Marge Piercy as being in dialogue with Firestone, not really sort of trying to envision or implement Firestone society. And I think one of the ways that she does that is precisely in terms of Marge Piercy's sensitivity to the intersecting ways in which Connie Ramos is oppressed. That she is oppressed as a Mexican-American woman, that she's oppressed as a poor woman, that she's oppressed in virtue of her sex as well. And Piercy, I think, in really quite sensitive ways, explores the mutual implications of those forms of oppression. And Connie has had a child, but Connie has at one point hit her child and broken her child's arm, and social services have taken the child away and adopted the child off into a white family. And Connie is left kind of absolutely distraught. Piercy's novel does a lot of work in terms of not excusing the violence towards the child or asking us to downplay it, but in asking us to understand how that act of violence might be an act of violence that was used from a kind of relentless deprivation that Connie suffers. And the analysis that the novel offers to us is basically that a kind of healthy form of narcissism is being, or healthy form of self-love is being disallowed. Connie, because she exists in a society that constantly tells her that her very existence is a kind of crime. Reproduction is understood as reproduction of the self because Connie is structurally prohibited from loving herself. Well, she does love her daughter, but the act of violence against her daughter is willing us to understand almost a kind of violence against the self. So just this sort of very long answer, just to add to that, one thing is, so in metapoiesis there are artificial wombs, they're called brood because that's how children come into being. And Connie is horrified by that. So Connie kind of says, this is awful. I can't imagine being denied the kind of the pleasure of childbirth, the pleasure of pregnancy. I can't imagine having someone being denied that biological connection to one's own child. And the metapoiesis guide kind of gives the reason why they wanted to break that genetic bond, and that's very Firestonian. But I think what's interesting is that Piercy doesn't have Connie say, yes, you're right, I see your point. So some kind of dialectic or dialogic quality is maintained. We have the kind of Firestonian position being represented by metapoiesis society. We have Connie's partial resistance to at least that aspect of it without that being resolved. And I think Piercy, in some of her kind of later comments on her novel, I think is quite explicit that she wanted to leave it unresolved so that it would be there as a dialogue to prompt the reader rather than presenting a kind of definitive answer.
Yeah, actually, that was one thing I always found that struck me with Firestone was not necessarily didn't disagree with it, but the two aspects of kind of the attachment that some people get, not everybody gets with, when they have a child, a lot of, people that have kids, they get very, you can get very attached to what you're wearing. And secondly, there's also there's definitely an aspect of pain and suffering and kind of like that individual pain and suffering when you bring a child into the world. And I found that very interesting, kind of I don't know, how do you kind of work with that within kind of a communal aspect if there is still an individual that has to suffer, I guess, whatever, depends. I know some people don't suffer don't suffer, some people don't necessarily have a bad experience with childbirth, but, it's one thing that kind of always struck me as it was a little bit of a thorny question.
Yes, I think it is a thorny issue really with Firestone, and I still don't know in my own mind how important the artificial womb is for Firestone. At one level, it seems not to be particularly important because one could imagine non-nuclear families, extended forms of child rearing. One could imagine the implementation of many of the things that she wants without the elimination of biological procreation. And she even says that in a society that had artificial wombs, it might be the case that some people would still wish to procreate biologically. She says she's got this weird thing about it as a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing in the way that people wear white at their weddings. Seems a bit far to go for a gag. But then there does seem to be potentially a problem there because she also says one of the problems with biological procreation is precisely the suffering that it often entails. And one of the problems with that is it then creates a sense of kind of indebtedness or ownership. So the mother says to the child, you don't know the pain I went through. Yeah. So given some of those comments, it's quite hard to think that biological procreation and genetic kinship wouldn't present some kind of problem for her.
Do you think Firestone is right that the oppression of women is based on biology?
I think it's plausible when one understands the subtlety of what Firestone is arguing. So she's sometimes taken to be a biological determinist, and I don't think that she is. I don't think she is in the way that she's accused. So what's really, really important is that she says, biology is at the origins of this problem, but then biology becomes socially reinforced. So I think she thinks that at the point that we're in the late 20th century, in what we would now call the societies of the global north, the main contributor to the oppression of women is actually the social reinforcements that are built up upon the original biological problem.
And the logic of capitalism.
And the logic of capitalism, exactly. And that seems plausible to me. I mean, it also seems to me that it is still the case, and someone was saying that earlier, in the UK today, pregnant people are clearly being discriminated against and exploited in all sorts of ways, and the reproductive and the caring work typically performed by women is being exploited in all sorts of ways. So I think that's absolutely right as well. I think it's brave and interesting that Firestone is saying, look, can you point to me an example of any society that hasn't been characterised by some form of male domination? And if you can't, then doesn't that suggest to us that biology or biological conditions are somehow involved in this? That seems very plausible to me as well. I don't think I can go further than that. And I don't know, maybe I'm hedging my bets too much there, but I don't want to go further than that kind of plausible. I don't know.
I think what you said makes a lot of sense. Because I said earlier, we have these biological chains that again, that you can't separate until you have something like a external womb. And as I said, for the human race to grow their understanding through that and that linkage to property and then wanting to leave legacies, how it's kind of it's been used as a tool to kind of hyper extend the flames of the patriarchy. But essentially, by fixing by creating external wounds, you're not going to fix the patriarchy because it's kind of grown so much into the system. So it's not an intrinsic part of how the patriarchy affects women, but it's a contributor.
Yeah.
But it's like even if you don't have artificial wounds, you can still try to change societal rules and that conditioning to a point that it doesn't become as prevalent. It doesn't feel as people aren't as entombed by their biological fate, as it were.
So I think you could imagine a society in which biological procreation is still the norm. Maybe there's no possibility of exogenesis. Maybe there will be at some point in the future. Maybe there won't be. Who knows? But let's imagine a society where biological procreation continues. One thing that follows from Firestone is we absolutely shouldn't valorize the natural. We should absolutely direct resources into alleviating the possible harm suffered by gestators.
I just, for this part of the conversation in particular, I just kept thinking about how the dialectic of sex seems to have been born from or its critical framework and its vision seem to have been born from her experiences of political organising. That she then, from what you said, stepped back from for various reasons. And I wondered if it's possible, maybe this isn't part of the research you did either, but if it's possible to talk a bit more about how her political organising is related to the dialectic of sex, in terms of both its possibilities and its limitations around the types of solidarity that she did or didn't build with that framework.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I probably can't do justice to that question because it's a really big but important question. Something that I can say that might be like a partial response would be, of course, one of the things that's distinctive about that moment is separatism.
Yeah.
So a lot of women in this period decided that because of the sexism within the new leftist movements, they had to form their own groups because any groups which involved men just became dominated by men and replicated sexism. So I think in terms of her political organising, Firestone did that. But one of the things that's very interesting about the dialectic of sex is that in many ways it's quite sympathetic towards men, in that it absolutely recognises men as being the beneficiaries of patriarchy, but also in a certain sense as being deformed by it. So she sees, the nuclear family, or she sees the biological family, which in the present moment is the nuclear family, as being deforming of everybody within it. So power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. She doesn't literally quote that, but I think that's very much at stake in her depiction of basically how boys become men. She talks about the young boy who is himself in a certain sense almost kind of victimized by the father, and who is initially aligned with, loves the mother, is aligned with the mother. but comes to recognise that he's being offered by the father entrance into the world of adventures. And the boy eventually, well, most of the time, decides to take that route, which means that he has to break his identification with his mother. And this produces men who are just fucked up in various ways, but particularly in relationship to women, is what she says. So she sees this kind of post-revolutionary society as one in which men will be liberated from the shackles of masculinity as much as women will be liberated from the shackles of femininity. And she actually imagines this as a world in which gender will have ceased to matter. And I think that's what sex will have ceased to matter because gender won't really exist. And it's one of the ways in which I think that her work really speaks to our present moment. She's anticipating gender abolitionism.
And has she been taken up as a sort of gender queering, gender abolitionist
She has.
figure?
Yeah. So there's xenofeminism. So Helen Hester, in her book describing her version of xenofeminism, explicitly locates Firestone as a kind of key inspiration for various facets of her xenofeminism, her anti-naturalism, her pro-technology.
So which is xenofeminism?
Xenofeminism, yeah.
Xeno, so as in, we often use the word xenophobia. So it would be the alien, the other. So the subtitle to the Xenofeminist Manifesto is a manifesto for alienation. So it reclaims alienation as a positive thing. If you're talking about in Firestone terms, alienation from nature might be a good thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But so one of the planks of xenofeminism is gender abolitionism, and Hester explicitly cites Firestone as her influence there. So Firestone imagines that in the post-revolutionary society, there will be a kind of, basically everyone's sexuality will be a kind of pansexuality, a return to Freudian polymorphous perversity, and there will no longer be such a thing as homosexuality or heterosexuality. She sees both of those things as, in a sense, pathologies, because any kind of exclusive sexual choice based on the supposed sex or anatomy of another person is for her the product of the taboos that come about through patriarchal capitalism. So get rid of those taboos, those repressions. We will fall in love with persons and not body parts. So the xenofeminists aren't the only people that have made that claim about Firestone. I can't remember who else, but there's also Lisa Downing and someone whose name is kind of escaping me. It's something like Lane Mackenzie. But both of them argue for Firestone as basically a proto-queer theorist.
Totally.
But one of the things which is really interesting about this, and it comes back to your point about, Firestone is an exemplary, bold, incredibly inspiring, productive thinker, and desperately wrong on several things, and both of those things at the same time. I think that's really, really encapsulated here, because I think it's absolutely right to read her as a proto-queer theorist, and indeed, as an example, potentially as a pro-trans radical feminist. Yeah. And at the same time, there are elements of homophobia in the text. Yeah. So where she talks about male homosexuality, she makes these glib comments about, male homosexuals, they're very often the worst misogynists of the lot. And she says things like homosexuality is a sickness. And you understand that it also means that heterosexuality is a sickness. And she's very, very clear on that. But she's still unproblematically calling homosexuality a sickness in the context where homosexuality was being presented as a sickness. Like, you've got this proto-queer theory, which is also homophobic in dimensions. And you've got this text, which in one sense seems to be pro kind of transfeminism. And yet, simply talks about people who have wombs as being women. No problematizing, no troubling of that whatsoever. It's complete binary gender. So in both of those ways, it kind of encapsulates what's so frustrating and tantalizing about Firestone's work. Also really, really important is that for Firestone, there is no link or no inevitable link between the having of the womb and femininity. And there's no intrinsic link between the having of a penis and masculinity, including the most toxic forms of masculinity. So she's not a radical feminist who thinks, for example, that men are somehow determined to be rapists because they've got penises or because they've got lots of testosterone. She absolutely does not go in for that kind of essentialism.
Yeah.
I suspect that TERFs tend to be probably more aligned with that aspects of that kind of radical feminism and not so much with Firestone. Because for Firestone, yes, having a womb or having a penis makes all of the difference historically, but only because of the consequences of those things for reproductive function. Once the link with reproductive function, once the creation of a division of labour around reproduction is broken through whatever means, then having a womb or having a penis no longer has any particular significance. She says in a post-revolutionary society, anatomical differences will continue to exist, but they will have lost their cultural significance. So we will no longer be able to predict anything about what a human being will be like on the basis of what anatomy they apparently have.
In what respects is he, she, and it a Firestonian text?
We've got now not a utopian future, but a dystopian future, where I suppose it's America, North America, has been divided up by multinational corporations into these kind of enclaves for white-collar corporate workers that are called multis. But then there are a very few areas of kind of like free areas that have managed to exist without being either one of those two things. And we've got a character called Shira, who is a young woman who has worked for a corporation. She's had a child with her corporate husband. They've divorced, and with the backing of the corporation, he's been able to gain full custody over their child. So she's gone home to this kind of free state, Tivka, to her grandmother who brought her up. And this free state is a kind of, it's quite a utopic space, really, of a kind of Jewish feminist, socialist ethics in practice. There is a family friend called Avram, who's a kind of Victor Frankenstein type figure, who has created a cyborg. And the cyborg has been created completely illegally and illicitly, but the cyborg has been created in order to defend Tivka against the encroachments of the multinational corporations. And this story is paralleled by the story of Prague in 1600, where the Rabbi Joseph Lowe creates the golem in order to protect the Jewish community from violence and destruction. So we've got the golem Joseph made out of clay, and we've got the cyborg Yod made by Avram. Yeah. So we've got these kind of two parallel stories. And so because we've got a cyborg, like this 1991 novel is typically read in relationship to Don Haraway's work on cyborgs, as you said. But so I've been arguing that actually this novel is also quite Firestonian. And the reason I think it's quite Firestonian is because it's fundamentally concerned with reproduction. We've got a number of characters who are mothers, however, are mothers who have rejected motherhood. So in Prague in 1600, we have a female protagonist called Shiva, and she's a midwife. She's had a child herself, but she hasn't wanted to be a mother. So her child is being looked after by family. And the novel makes no kind of negative judgment about her of that. And we've got a number of characters who are mothers, but who haven't necessarily, who are biologically mothers, but who aren't mothering, have chosen not to mother. And we've also got other characters who have chosen to mother or to parent, but who aren't biological mothers to the children that they're parenting. But it's also deeply concerned with reproduction in relationship to the golem Joseph and the cyborg Yod. So both of these figures have been created basically as weapons, and they've been created as sentient life forms who nonetheless are instrumentalized. So they are created to serve a particular purpose and to understand their identities in relationship to that purpose. But the novel finishes basically by kind of being very clear that it is always wrong to bring life into the world for any purpose other than to live its own life. And that is quite clearly extrapolated into being a message about parenting. So even in the context of biological parenting, to have a child, in order to have that child live out the ambitions that you haven't been able to fulfill is a kind of serious wrong. It's a serious harm. It's not something that should ever be undertaken. So it's a novel, I think, that's interested in what later Donna Haraway has called the distinction between reproduction and parenting, I think. I can't remember. But basically the distinction that she's trying to make is something like this. So reproduction is an attempt to reproduce the self. It involves precisely those ego investments that Firestone is talking about. Whereas parenting is a much more kind of disinterested desire to nurture another person for their own sake. So the novel comes out very clearly in favour of that and suggests that that is also a possibility with biological parenting. And I think that's interesting to come back to this question about, would Firestone think that to bring about the society, the kind of society that she wants, we would have to completely eliminate biological procreation? I think the answer is no, as long as biological procreation can happen in the vein of parenting and not reproduction. So for as long as biological parenting is about ego investment in the idea of my child and my child having to live out my own desires and ambitions, there's a problem. But if it's conceivable that biological parenting could be not that, then I think that achieves what Firestone is trying to achieve.
So I had two questions that I was going to ask. I think the last one we've kind of covered because it was really looking at your own work as a kind of critical Firestonian and the ways that this can be applied to issues today. And the other one was really about airless spaces, which is her last novel. And so I wanted to actually just maybe take a little quote from the airless spaces and then maybe we could just use that as a way to wrap up. Yeah. You write that you propose reading airless spaces as a kind of coda for the Dialectics of Sex in its documenting of a brutal and alienating society in which people are subordinated to profit. It depicts the nightmare inversion of the more humane society glimpsed in the dialectic. In what ways can airless spaces be read alongside the Dialectic of Sex?
So airless spaces, it's a very short book, it's actually not a novel, it's a kind of series of vignettes, and it's a series of vignettes of people within the psychiatric services of New York State or moving beyond those services in the kind of wider community, but in various conditions of deprivation and ill health and isolation, basically. And the vignettes initially are written in the third person, but eventually they become first person, and it becomes clear that even some of the third person ones are basically Firestone writing about her own experiences, because she became very unwell. I think she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she eventually died when she was found in her flat, and she died through starvation. So yeah, and that's seemingly maybe one of the reasons as well behind her kind of retreat from feminist activism and disappearance from the scene of feminist writing, that she increasingly suffered bouts of depression and ill health that culminated in her institutionalization basically in psychiatric services in New York. So that's what Airless Spaces is about. I kind of struggled, when I was writing the book on Firestone, I kind of struggled with the question of whether or not to include that, and if I did include it, how to include it. And the reason for that is because I've had an experience of teaching Firestone, where despite the fact that the students are very often incredibly interesting, critically engaged, open-minded in relation to Firestone and, the kind of, the ambition, the boldness of her, of what she's trying to do. There's also something that I've sometimes encountered from some students, which is to read the Dialectic of Sex as a kind of symptom. So when they learn that Firestone became seriously mentally unwell, they tend to think, okay, so she was always mentally ill, and the Dialectic of Sex is a symptom of that latent illness, basically, before it became manifest as illness. And of course, that's deeply problematic, for one thing, because it then, once you think of the text as a symptom, you can easily dismiss the text. We don't need to take it seriously any longer. It's a kind of symptom of her mental illness. So I didn't want that to be a possibility, but I also didn't want to ignore this book. So I saved it for the kind of coda to the book. And what I've said is that I think it's like the society, if it even warrants that word, it probably doesn't, that we witness in Airless Spaces is like the kind of, it's what happens if the revolution doesn't take place, basically. It's the kind of, the continuation of the society that Firestone is diagnosing in 1969, which is a society which is bleak, brutal, where the family itself is a kind of airless space. And what I mean by that is that she begins airless spaces by recounting a dream she has. And in the dream, she's on something like the Titanic, and people are celebrating on the upper decks. But she can't celebrate. She regards the celebration as a kind of false merriment. She knows that disaster is on the horizon. So she goes to the lower decks and she's trying to find some safe space, and she finds a refrigerator, and she thinks, I'll climb into the refrigerator and it will provide an air locket so that when the ship sinks, I'll have the chance of surviving. But the point about the airless space, therefore, is that it's a space that you turn to for shelter, but it itself then becomes oppressive. And I think in a way that what she's saying about the nuclear family is that the nuclear family is an airless space. Confronted by a bleak, loveless, alienated society, people turn to the family and embrace the family because it feels like the only space where you can have some love and some care. But then it brings with it all of these various oppressions at the same time, Firestone is saying. So I think the society of airless space is what happens if the revolution doesn't take place, basically. And I think rather than kind of treating the question of Firestone's mental illness as, okay, we don't need to take her political work seriously, I think we can instead think about that relationship as a provocation to have a political understanding of mental illness, to understand mental illness as something that comes about in alienated, estranged, debased, brutalised and brutalising societies. So that's what that connection is about.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you so much for tonight.
And thank you for listening to the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you want to join one of the meetups, you can find the details on explodingappendix.com. You can also find us on most of the social medias, Instagram, SoundCloud, and Eventbrite, to name a few. But yeah, search Exploding Appendix and you will find us. Thanks again. Bye.
Yeah.